Imagine this. It's an ordinary Tuesday in Beirut. You walk into your bank like you've done 1,000 times before. Not to do anything dramatic, not to move millions, just to withdraw enough to live. $500. Groceries. Rent. The kind of boring adult transaction that makes you feel like your life is stable. And the screen confirms it. Your account is there. $200,000. A lifetime of waiting tables in Detroit. A decade of construction in Dubai heat. 30 years of teaching, saving, saying no to vacations. It's all preserved in clean digital numbers. You step up to the teller gives you a tired smile, one that says they VA delivered this line to 100 people today and they say, softly, like they're apologizing for the laws of physics, "I'm sorry, we can only give you 50, not $50, 50 in Lebanese pounds." And by the time you walk out of that marble lobby and reach the grocery store, your 50 has already shrunk again, because in Lebanon, money doesn't just lose value by the month or by the week. Sometimes it loses value between the bank door and the sidewalk. That moment standing there, realizing your savings exist only as a permission slip, was the moment millions of Lebanese learned the most terrifying lesson in modern finance. Your money is not your money when the system is starving. And Lebanon didn't merely suffer a recession, suffered something rarer and more violent. A collapse so extreme that global institutions would later rank it among the worst economic crashes seen in modern history. Depositors didn't take a hit. They watched their lives get quietly erased, tens of billions, vaporized into accounting smoke. This story has villains, but not the Hollywood kind. No masked thieves, no hackers. No single bad banker who went rogue. In Lebanon, the state became the scammer. The banking sector became the funnel. And the central bank, the institution designed to be the firewall, became the engine room of a machine that could only survive as long as new dollars kept flowing in. The most brutal part. For years, it looked like a miracle. So to understand the crash, you have to understand the illusion. You have to understand why educated people, doctors, engineers, shop owners, diaspora families who knew how the world worked still trusted the system with everything. We rewind to the early 1990s. The Civil War ends in 1990, and Lebanon emerges like a body stumbling out of a burning building. Bullet holes in apartments. Infrastructure shattered. Trust between communities held together with fragile stitches. And yet, Lebanon does what Lebanon always does. It rebuilds with sheer willpower and diaspora money. A new political order takes shape. Reconstruction becomes a national religion. Beirut begins to polish its face again, wide avenues, new towers, gleaming storefronts. The return of nightlife. The country loves the phoenix metaphor, and for a while, it feels real, like the ashes are behind them. And then, in the center of the new Lebanon, quiet financial doctrine is introduced, simple enough to fit on a napkin. $1 equals 1,500 Lebanese pounds. That's it. A peg, a promise. A fixed exchange rate that becomes the psychological backbone of the entire society. You could pay in dollars or pounds, and nobody blinked. You could hand over a crisp $100 bill, buy something trivial, and receive your change in Lebanese pounds at the sacred rate. The number became holy. It wasn't just policy, it was identity. It was the sign that Lebanon was normal. And when you stabilize currency, you stabilize perception. You stabilize the story people tell themselves when they wake up. We are safe. We are back. We are not like the region. Beirut is different. That perception is priceless. It's what attracts money. It's what invites investors. It's what convinces a diaspora to bring their life savings home instead of leaving it in Frankfurt or Houston. And then the second miracle arrives. Interest rates. Lebanese banks offered returns that sounded like fantasy, especially to diaspora families who had lived through boring Western banking systems with near-zero yields. 5%, 7%, eventually 10% on dollar deposits. Think about what that does to a human brain. 10% a year in dollars feels like gravity has been reversed. It makes ordinary people feel like they discovered a secret door in the global economy. Deposit $1 million, earn a six-figure salary without working. A retiree's dream, an expat's reward, a shortcut to dignity after decades of sacrifice. And the pitch was always the same. Lebanon is stable. The currency is pegged. Our banks are strong. Your dollars are safe here. And the diaspora believed it because the story wasn't completely insane. Lebanon did have something powerful, a global network of Lebanese families across Brazil, West Africa, the Gulf, Europe, and North America. In countries where governments fail, diaspora remittances can function like a shadow central bank. Money comes in every month like oxygen. For years, billions flowed in. Banks became vacuum cleaners for dollars. And what did the banks do with those dollars? This is where the fairy tale becomes a horror movie quietly, politely, behind the curtains. Because the banks were not investing in productive growth, they weren't building factories, they weren't funding an export machine. They weren't turning Lebanon into a technology hub or an industrial power. They were doing something much simpler. They were lending to the Lebanese state. And the Lebanese state, in economic terms, was not a business. It was a hungry organism. It consumed money to feed patronage networks, inflated payrolls, political deals. And the kind of corruption that doesn't look like a villain twirling a mustache looks like paperwork. Committees, cousins hired into ministries. Contracts written for friends. The government was happy because it could borrow without reform. The banks were happy because they could earn easy profits lending to the government and placing money with the central bank. The public was happy because they saw their deposits growing and their currency stable. And the central bank governor Riad Salameh became the magician of the era. The man who stabilized Lebanon. He was celebrated. Praised internationally. Treated like a financial wizard who could make a fragile country look like Switzerland with sunshine. But here is the cold truth about pegs and miracles. A bank pays you interest when it can generate real returns. Interest must come from productivity somewhere: exports, investment, industry, surplus. If Lebanon is importing fuel, medicine, food paid in dollars while collecting taxes in Lebanese pounds. If the country exports very little in return. If the state runs chronic deficits, then where is the profit engine that can sustain 10% dollar returns for years? There isn't one. So what was paying the interest? New dollars, new deposits. New deposits, new diaspora money. The next person in line. And that is the shape of the trap. Not a single dramatic theft, but a system where the only way to honor yesterday's promise is to attract tomorrow's victim. For a long time, it worked because belief is a form of capital, and Lebanon had enormous belief. But around 2011, the external world started to change. The region destabilized. Tourism weakened. Politics strained relationships with Gulf investors. The flow of fresh dollars began to slow. Nothing collapses the moment oxygen reduces, but you feel it. First as a tightening, then as a panic. And inside the central bank, the magician looked at the balance sheet and understood what it meant. The machine could not survive a drought. A normal central banker would have devalued. It would have been painful, yes, but controlled. Like surgery, Lebanon didn't choose surgery. Lebanon chose magic, a last trick. A maneuver with a harmless name that sounded technical, almost boring, like something only economists would care about. They called it financial engineering. And that's where the miracle ends, and the robbery begins. When a banker uses a phrase like financial engineering, your instincts should scream. Because real economies don't need engineering to stay alive. They need exports, productivity, and trust. Engineering is what you do when the plane is already falling and you're trying to build wings out of paperwork on the way down. By 2016, Lebanon's situation was simple in a way that should have been embarrassing. The currency peg $1 equals 1,500 Lira was still being defended like a national religion, but the dollars required to defend it were bleeding out of the system. Lebanon was importing almost everything it consumed: fuel, medicine, machinery, food. Those imports needed hard currency, and the government, burdened by corruption, patronage, and an electricity sector that ate the budget like a monster, couldn't generate enough dollars to pay. So the central bank needed an injection of USD, fast. Not in theory. In reality, it needed physical oxygen. But the dollars weren't in the central bank anymore. They were in the commercial bank, sitting in the accounts of ordinary people and the diaspora. The savings that families had wired home because Lebanon promised safety. And that's when Riad Salameh, the magician, made an offer to the banks that felt like free money. He said, "Bring me your dollars. Lock them up with the central bank, and I'll make you rich. Not gradually, not responsibly, rich in a way that looked impossible. Here's the mechanism in human language. The circle that printed profits without creating wealth. Step 1. The central bank created Lebanese Lira not by earning it, but by issuing it. It offered commercial banks huge amounts of Lira at a low interest rate. Cheap credit, a gift. Step 2. The commercial banks took those newly created Lira and converted them into dollars at the official peg. 1,500 as, if the peg was still backed by reality. Step 3. Those banks then deposited the dollars back into the central bank. And here's where the engineering becomes witchcraft. Step 4. The central bank paid those banks extraordinary returns on the dollar deposits. Returns so high that banks could sometimes book massive profits immediately, numbers like 20%, 30%, even 40% in certain structures. And everyone clapped. The banks looked profitable, their balance sheets looked healthy. Their shareholders got dividends. Executives took bonuses. Riad Salameh kept the peg alive and maintained the illusion that Lebanon was stable. But if you zoom out for 1 second, something is wrong. Where did the central bank get the dollars to pay those returns? It didn't. It promised future dollars it couldn't earn. It was borrowing tomorrow to pay today. It was paying interest in a currency it didn't generate. And that means the only way the machine could continue was if more dollars entered the system constantly. So the commercial banks did what every Ponzi structure eventually demands. They hunted new money. They started calling expats like salespeople. They offered higher and higher rates to pull in deposits. Bring your dollars home. Lock it for 3 years and we'll give you 12%. 5 years. We can do 15%. This wasn't banking anymore. This was recruitment. The yield wasn't a reward. It was bait. And this is the moment Lebanon crossed a quiet line from a fragile system into a structurally doomed one. Because once a bank's business model becomes, we need new deposits to survive, you are no longer funding an economy. You are feeding a furnace. The IMF's polite panic. International institutions aren't dramatic. They don't publish headlines like, "This is a Ponzi scheme." They write phrases like, "balance sheet complexity." In finance language, that often means, "We don't believe this is real, and we suspect you're lying." But we can say it out loud because you re a sovereign state and everyone wants to pretend diplomacy still works. By 2018, the risk was no longer theoretical. The Lebanese banking sector had effectively taken a huge share of the nation's deposits. Sand placed them with one counterparty. Not thousands of borrowers, not diversified loans. One borrower, the central bank, and through it, the Lebanese state. In a normal country, banks spread risk. Mortgages across 1 million households. Loans across thousands of businesses, credit across sectors and regions in Lebanon. The banks piled most of the chips on a single number at the roulette table and called it stability. And the terrifying part is, this wasn't hidden from the political class. The government loved it, because it meant the state could keep spending without reforms. No meaningful taxes, no serious cuts, no restructuring, no accountability. A bloated public sector continued to expand. The electricity company remained a bottomless pit. Political elites treated ministries like employment agencies for their supporters. And every time the bill came due, the central bank was expected to engineer another miracle. That's why this wasn't just financial mismanagement. It was a political economy built on extraction. The state extracted from the banks. The banks extracted from the depositors. The depositors extracted hope from the peg. And the peg extracted reality from the country. By 2019, the system was a Jenga tower with trembling hands holding it up. The smallest shock could tip it. People assume the shock was war, or invasion, or some external catastrophe. But the push that finally made the tower fall wasn't a missile, it was an app. A $6 fee. A tiny monthly tax that hit a nerve so raw it exposed the entire lie. Because when a country is already starving, the smallest insult feels like a knife. And in October 2019, Lebanon bled into the streets. Not because of $6, but because the people suddenly realized, if they can tax WhatsApp, they can take everything. And behind the chanting crowds, the real panic began. Not in parliament, not on the streets, in the banks. Because the insiders knew something the public didn't yet understand. The vaults were empty. the dollars were gone. And the moment people tried to withdraw, the entire miracle would be revealed as a trap. That revelation begins with fire. Not metaphorical fire. Actual fire trees burning, helicopters grounded, a country watching itself collapse while its leaders do nothing. And then, October 17th, the day the house of cards finally fell. If you want to understand how a system collapses, don't watch the stock market. Watch how the state responds when things catch fire, literally. In October 2019, just days before Lebanon's financial system imploded, the mountains were burning. Massive wildfires tore through the Shof region, devouring ancient pine forests that had stood for centuries. Smoke filled the air, settled over villages, and the state did nothing. It later emerged that Lebanon owned 3 firefighting helicopters Sikorsky's donated years earlier. They were grounded not because of weather, not because of war, but because the government hadn't bothered to pay for maintenance. That image became symbolic. A country burning, while the tools to save it sat idle due to neglect. The public rage was already boiling when, on October 17, 2019, the government announced a new measure, desperate, small, and unbelievably tone-deaf. A daily tax on internet-based calls, 20 cents a day. About $6 a month. A WhatsApp tax. To an outsider, it sounded trivial. But in Lebanon, WhatsApp wasn't just an app. It was how families survived. How workers talked to relatives abroad. How the poor avoided the inflated prices of the state telecom monopoly. It was one of the last things that felt free. The message was clear. We have run out of money and now, we are coming for yours. That night, the streets erupted. From Tripoli in the north to Tyre in the south, something unprecedented happened. Sectarian lines dissolved. Christians, Sunnis, Shia, Druze people who had been trained for decades to blame each other chanted the same words. Kellen, Yani, Kellen. All of them means all of them. The anger wasn't ideological, it was existential. But while the world's cameras focused on burning tires and chanting crowds, something far more important was happening in silence. The banks panicked. They knew what the public didn't yet know. The dollars were gone. The money that depositors believed was sitting safely in vaults had been lent to the central bank and spent. Burned defending a peg that no longer existed in reality. So the banks made a decision that would permanently shatter trust. They closed. Not for a day, not for a weekend, for weeks. ATMs went dark. Online banking froze. Transfers stopped. Imagine logging into your account, seeing your life savings still displayed, but being unable to touch it. Like a photograph of a house you no longer own. When banks finally reopened in November 2019, people rushed in not to withdraw everything, just to secure something. That's when the rules changed. You can withdraw $200 per week. No international transfers. Credit card limits are reduced. And all of this happened without a law. Without parliamentary approval. Without legal clarity. These were illegal capital controls imposed by private banks to save themselves. And while ordinary people stood in line begging for access to their own money, something else happened quietly in the background. The politically connected got their money out. Billions flowed abroad during the weeks when banks were closed for security. The doors were locked for the public but wide open for those who knew where to knock. This wasn't mismanagement anymore. This was extraction. The moment the currency broke for 22 years, the peg had felt immortal. But pegs don't die gracefully. They snap. By November 2019, the black market rate crossed 1,600 lira to the dollar. Then 2,000, then 3,000. The idea that the lira and the dollar were interchangeable died in real time. And then Lebanon invented something new, something almost poetic in its cruelty. The lawler, a word combining lira and dollar, coined by analysts to describe what people suddenly realized they were holding. On your banking app, your account still said USD, but try to transfer it abroad. Try to withdraw it in cash. Try to use it online. You couldn't. Those weren't dollars anymore. They were bank dollars digits trapped inside a broken system. And so Lebanon split its money into 2 parallel universes. Fresh dollars, real U.S. banknotes brought into the country after the collapse. Lawlers, Pre-2019 deposits ghost money that looked real but couldn't escape the distinction became everything. Fresh dollars could buy food, fuel, medicine. Dollars could only be accessed under one condition. You had to destroy them. The haircut without a law. The central bank introduced a mechanism that deserves to be remembered as one of the most brutal financial tricks of modern times. Depositors were allowed to withdraw their dollars only in Lebanese Lira, an artificial exchange rate far below the real market rate. Let's translate this into human math. The real black market rate, 10,000 lira per dollar. The bank's withdrawal rate, 3,900 lira per dollar. You request $1,000 from your account. The bank gives you 3.9 million lira. You take that cash to a money changer to buy actual dollars. They give you $390. The rest is gone, not confiscated by law, not taxed transparently, just erased. This is what economists call a haircut, but in Lebanon, it was a silent, daily haircut applied only when people were desperate enough to eat. Over time, the losses grew. 30%, 50%, 70%. By 2023, many depositors had lost 85 to 90% of their life savings. And the darkest irony, this saved the banks, because deposits are a bank's liability. When your $1,000 becomes $100 in real value, the bank's debt to you shrinks. The system healed itself by cannibalizing its own middle class. Doctors, engineers, teachers, professors. The backbone of the country was wiped out not overnight, but transaction by transaction. People became so desperate to escape their trapped money that a secondary economy emerged. Real estate was sold at insane dollar prices. Luxury goods were bought with fake dollars just to get rid of them. Anything tangible was better than numbers on a screen. By mid-2020, Lebanon's middle class had effectively ceased to exist. And then, just when it seemed impossible for things to get worse, at 6:07 p.m. on August 4, 2020, the sky tore itself apart, and the collapse stopped being abstract. It became physical. Glass, blood, fire, and a city blown open by the same negligence that destroyed its economy. At 6:07 p.m. on August 4, 2020, Beirut learned what happens when economic collapse meets physical reality. First came the sound, not an explosion, but a deep roar, like the sky itself tearing open. Then a flash. Then a pressure wave moving faster than sound, punching through walls, shattering glass into millions of knives, lifting cars off highways and folding entire buildings like paper. In less than a second, Beirut was disemboweled. More than 200 people were killed, over 7,000 injured. Nearly 300,000 left homeless, the equivalent of wiping an entire mid-sized Western city off the housing map. This was not a random tragedy. This was the economic model made physical. For 6 years, 2,750 tons of ammonium nitrate sat in Hangar 12 at the port. Everyone knew, port authorities knew, judges knew, security agencies knew, prime ministers knew, presidents knew, and no one acted. Why? Because in Lebanon, responsibility is political suicide. Doing nothing is safer than doing the right thing. That same logic governed the banking system, the electricity sector, the budget, the detand now. It governed explosives. The port was Lebanon's economic lungs. Over 80% of the country's imports flowed through it. Food, medicine, fuel, raw materials. The explosion didn't just kill people, it destroyed supply chains. It vaporized the national grain silos, which held most of the country's strategic food reserves. Suddenly, Lebanon was bankrupt and unable to store what it needed to survive. In a functional country, insurance would step in. Lebanon's insurance sector was tied to the banks, and the banks were already dead. Most families rebuilt their shattered homes using fresh dollars hidden under mattresses, cash smuggled into a cashless country. And then came the darkness. The electricity black hole. If the banks were the heart of Lebanon's corruption, electricity was its black hole. For decades, the state power company Electricité du Liban lost $1.50 to $2 billion every year. Nearly 40% of Lebanon's sovereign debt existed just to keep the lights on. And yet, even before the collapse, electricity only ran a few hours a day. After the financial crash, the state ran out of dollars to buy fuel. By 2021, Most of the country received 1 to 2 hours of power per day, sometimes 0. Hospitals ran on generators, praying diesel wouldn't run out mid-surgery. Refrigerators failed. Food spoiled. Phones died. Life shrank to daylight hours. To survive, people turned to the generator mafia. Every neighborhood had one. Private diesel operators, often politically protected, charging extortionate fees in fresh dollars. You paid taxes for electricity you didn't get, then paid a cartel just to turn on a fan. When fuel subsidies were lifted, the humiliation reached its peak. People lined up for gas at 3 a.m., waiting 6 to 8 hours. Fights broke out. Guns were pulled. People were stabbed over gasoline. Picture this. A doctor finishes a 24-hour shift in a hospital with no AC, then sleeps in his car at a gas station just to make it back to work the next day. That was Lebanon in 2021. The explosion destroyed infrastructure. The banking crisis destroyed savings. The fuel crisis destroyed dignity. And yet somehow the country didn't fully die. It transformed. The zombie economy. Walk through Beirut today and you'll notice something unsettling. The restaurants are full. The clubs are packed. Range Rovers crowd valet lines. It looks alive. This is the zombie economy system where the heart is gone, but the body still moves. When banks died, Lebanon reverted to something ancient: cash. Credit cards became souvenirs. Checks became museum pieces. Entire businesses ran on backpacks of money. The largest Lebanese banknote, 100,000 lira, was once worth $66. Now it's worth about $1. A $150 dinner bill requires a literal brick of cash. Restaurants bought money counting machines meant for narco films. Eventually, even the government gave up pretending. By 2023, Lebanon unofficially dollarized again. Prices were posted in USD. Menus printed in dollars. If you had fresh cash, life was manageable. If you didn't, too were finished. A two-tier society emerged. Tier 1. The fresh dollar class: remote workers, expats, diaspora-supported families. Political insiders, money launderers. For them, Lebanon is cheap, luxurious, a paradise. Tier 2. The Lira class: teachers, soldiers, police, public servants. A soldier earning the equivalent of $50 a month. A general making less than a freelance designer. That is not just economic collapse. That is a national security risk. Survival, not recovery. Money now flows through remittance companies instead of banks. Western Union and OMT became Lebanon's de facto central bank. Remittances equal nearly 30% of GDP. Life support from abroad. And with cash dominance came something darker. Money laundering. No trails, no audits, no enforcement. Buying million-dollar apartments in cash became normal. International watchdogs threatened to graylist Lebanon financial quarantine. The elite didn't care. The system worked for them. And yet, amid the ruins, the people adapted again. Look at Beirut's rooftops, solar panels everywhere. In a cruel irony, Lebanon became a renewable energy pioneer, not out of environmental consciousness, but desperation. The state failed, so households built their own grid. It's the perfect metaphor. No institutions, no plan, just survival. But this isn't recovery. This is a hallucination powered by foreign cash, diesel fumes, and resilience stretched past breaking point. A zombie can walk, but it's still dead. And eventually, the bill arrives. That bill comes with 3 letters: IMF. At some point, every financial collapse reaches the same crossroads. Either the country confronts the truth openly, painfully, publicly, or it chooses the quiet option: delay, deny, and let time do the dirty work. Lebanon chose time. By 2022, the situation was no longer debatable. The state was bankrupt. The banks were insolvent. The currency was rubble. The middle class was gone. So the International Monetary Fund stepped in, not as a savior, but as an auditor. And the IMF made 3 demands, simple in principle, explosive in reality. First, audit the central bank. Follow the money. Name names. Show the public where the dollars went. Second, pass a formal capital controls law. Freeze transfers fairly. Stop the politically connected from smuggling what's left. Third, restructure the banks. Admit they are bankrupt. Wipe out shareholders. Protect what little remains for depositors. In return, the IMF offered $3 billion, not much, but enough to unlock further international aid. The Lebanese political class looked at that list and made a calculation. An audit would expose them. Bank restructuring would destroy their own stakes. Capital controls would block their escape routes, so they did nothing. And this is where Lebanon's crisis becomes uniquely cynical. Instead of reform, they chose inflation as a weapon. Because inflation does something magical for people in power, it erases debt without signatures. When a currency loses 98% of its value, liabilities disappear. The state's debt to banks vanishes. The bank's debt to depositors evaporates. The losses are not written off in Parliament, they're dissolved in the market. No one signs a document saying, "We stole your savings." The currency does it for them. This is the shadow plan. Let the lira burn. Let prices explode. Let time do what courage won't. Economists call it liquefying liabilities. Citizens call it theft. And then, after 30 years at the center of the system, the magician finally stepped off the stage. In July 2023, Riad Salameh left his post as central bank governor. For a while, he lived comfortably while European courts seized assets, froze accounts, issued warrants. Luxury apartments in Paris, accounts in Europe. The illusion of untouchability cracked. Then, in September 2024, something unprecedented happened. Riad Salameh was arrested in Beirut. Was this justice, or was it sacrifice? One man in handcuffs does not explain a system that required politicians to approve budgets, parliament to ignore warnings, banks to chase yield. Elites to extract first. Salameh engineered the machine. But the machine existed because everyone fed it. Today, Lebanon exists in a strange in-between state. It is not at war. It is not at peace. The state still exists on paper, but in practice, Lebanon has reverted to feudal economics. If you get sick, you don't rely on the state, you rely on your sect's hospital. If you need fuel, you don't call a utility, you call a local power broker. If you need work, you don't apply online, you ask your political patron. The central state has hollowed out, replaced by networks of loyalty and survival. The phoenix metaphor is gone. This time, Lebanon didn't rise. It fragmented. Final thoughts. The real lesson of Lebanon. So what is the real truth about Lebanon's economy? It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a single villain. It wasn't just geopolitics. It was mathematics. A fixed currency without reserves. Interest without productivity. Debt treated as income. Corruption treated as policy. And the most chilling part, the system relied on the resilience of the people. The bankers knew people would adapt. The politicians knew families would rely on diaspora money. They knew society would survive just enough to avoid total collapse. Resilience became a resource to be exploited. If this story feels distant, don't be comfortable. Because Lebanon is not unique, it is early. Whenever a country promises stability without transparency, whenever banks offer returns that defy global reality, whenever debt is masked as prosperity, you are watching the early stages of the same movie. Lebanon will survive. Its people are too alive, too stubborn, too human to disappear. But the savings of a generation, those are gone forever. And that is the final cost of believing in miracles financed by lies.